The sea between Dragonstone and the mainland lay lacquered and black beneath a bruised dawn, a stillness so complete that the waves seemed carved. From the saddle strapped between her dragon's shoulders, Rhaenyra Valyrian watched the mirror of water bow and ripple to Vermithor's steady breaths. Beyond the dark sheen, the lights of Massey's Hook were guttering, night town candles succumbing to morning. Smoke lifted from fishing huts like threads. The world smelled of salt, wet ash, and distant peat fires, and beneath it all the iron tang of Dragonstone's basalt ridges jagged up behind her like the vertebrae of some titanic beast. In the lodgements and halls cut into that old volcano, the banners of the freehold still hung. Rippling sea-green silk stitched with 14 flames, the ancient sigil of a power that had never fallen, that widened its fingers over the world and closed them when it wished. The banners were old, but the hands were not. Rhaenyra had been chosen because she looked west with a hunger that did not mortify her elders. The Triarch magistrates of the 14 Fires preferred stewards who bent their heads over ledgers and labyrinthine laws, but Westeros was not a sum to be tallied. It was 7 kingdoms peopled by men whose oaths meant what their swords could preserve, by women who held together keeps while the wind tried to tear them apart. It was oak and iron, peat and heather, faith and stubbornness. Could not be purchased. It could be bound, if the fetters were gilded and set swiftly around the wrist. Vermithor rumbled. He did not like to hover. Far off, a spray of white broke the glass sea as porpoises chased a braid of mackerel. The dragon's head turned with an intent that was not appetite. He liked the play of her mind, her anticipation. He was old, but he still liked beginnings. Down, she said, and they fell. The world joined itself above her in sky seam, and the air thundered along the dragon's wings. Vermithor's shadow swept the calm with a scythe. Rhaenyra felt the shrug of wind on her cheeks, smelled the hot stone breath that rose from Dragonstone's shoulders as they banked toward the pier where 2 ships lay at anchor. One was a dark Lysine cutter with a beak like a hawk's. The other was a Westerosi cog in Hightower gray with a lantern at its mast tip even in the morning, a courtesy flame that announced its owner's abiding, patient light. She set Vermithor down beyond the piers, on the bare lip where waves fretted low. Sailors scattered with reflexive cries that were part fear, part worship. The Hightower envoy did not scatter. He stood on the pier's end in a mantle the color of old parchment, the lantern sigil bright at his breast. He held a staff capped with iron that flashed once in the dull light when Vermithor's talons clanged against basalt. "Lady Rhaenyra," he said when she approached on boots still warm from the saddle. "Or is it magistrate now? Forgive me, I have not kept the title straight since Valyria began its new fashion of appointing governors with swords." He was too shallow-voiced to be a lord. She placed him Maester. "Rhaenyra is sufficient. The freehold has many names for the servants of its will, Maester Alistair. None of them will warm Dragonstone's halls if I misgovern." "Then we are alike," he said with a smile like someone stepping carefully across a frozen pond. "For if I misspeak, Old Town shall not forgive me either. The Hightower sends soft words and hard silver. The Citadel sends words of any kind you like, so long as they clothe truth. Truth is an ill-fitting garment," she said, "but I will hear it. Come and sit. There is a hearth that draws well in the old Admiral's chart room." He followed her into the keep that had been raised by some nameless craftsman who must have loved puzzles. The halls were a serpent of black stone, the windows narrow as knife slits. Servants kept quiet in a way that suggested they had watched dragons molt in these corridors and had learned the difference between fear and silence. They warmed their hands by the Admiral's fire. She offered him dark wine cut with boiled seawater, a Valyrian habit he politely did not imitate. "There is a conference," the Maester began after proper courtesies. "In Old Town, of lords both greater and less. The Hightower presides, of course, and the gardeners send their trusted vine. Lannisters come with gold and fewer smiles. The Stormlands with a greater number of the latter and smaller of the former. Rivermen are ever divided. A Stark will attend, I'm told, if the Snows do not object. There is even talk of a Dornsworn envoy of House Martell, which would be novel. The subject of this Congress is simple. Your banners. Our banners fly where we have placed them, said Rhaenyra. Does Old Town propose to legislate the wind? Old Town proposes to see it, the maester said, and to learn how many ships may be drawn under its course. Forgive me, the question is slavery, and dragons, and law. She sipped her wine. 3 questions. The freehold can spare 3 answers before noon. For the first, he said carefully, we cannot yield. The faith has its strictures, but even men without faith resist chains. I have brought none, she said. No slavers have called at Dragonstone since I took it, and none will while my banners hang here. The freehold's law is not a lariat we cast over each shore. The bonds of our colonies vary. Volantis may keep its whips, Pentos may not. Cohor and Norvos interpret the law, and Bravos ignores it, as is their taste for arrogance. Dragonstone's law will suit Westeros, or we will be asked to depart. I do not prefer to depart. He looked at her with a small relief he failed to hide. And dragons. Dragons will fly, she said. They are food for songs or for arrows as men please. But I am not here to set them on your fields. Do you suppose the freehold stupid or blood-crazed? Westeros can be bled white from the air. Isie. Not be held with fewer than a dozen great houses at our side. I am here to find them. And law. Law is a tongue we may both speak, she said. Trade law, harbor law, safe conducts and rights of settlement. A Valyrian quarter in Old Town, perhaps under customs that do not offend the faith. We will ban sacrifice and the harrowing of slaves within your walls if you will ban riots and mobs within ours. We will leave your hearts to your seps, but your ports will open. He smiled into the fire. You speak like a high-tower reeve, Lady Rhaenyra. I prefer to speak like a woman who has seen what dragonfire does to granaries. The freehold feeds itself with peace. Then you will find some in Old Town, he said. Our harbor is large, our laity patient, and our coin listen when ships speak. But your banners will be less welcome farther north. The Iron Islands for love of their tyrant, the Riverlands for fear of his shadow, the Stormlands for love of their pride. And the North because it is the North. And the Reach, he said with Hightower's old arrogance, which slipped on him like a mantle that belonged to his master, are the Reach. When he left her with parchment signatures, she watched Vermithor sleeping as only dragons sleep. His wings slack over his ribs, his eye a slit of molten gold, filling and emptying with each breath. The coal bed in his lair glowed. She leaned her palms on the hammered bronze railing and looked down at an old power that yet had new angles. Between now and harvest she would tour for courts, eat their oaths, spit out their schemes, and leave behind a network of promises taught as a harp. She did not know, as she counted the days in her head, that elsewhere the first slender strings were already being plucked. In Old Town, under the starry sept where candles made constellations of men's questions, a boy in a novice's brown robe set down a scroll and took up another. His name was Edric Flowers, which was an answer and a wound. From the harbor below he could hear the shouts of sailors, and sometimes at night he counted masts by the rhythm of footsteps on the quay. He had imagined dragons all his life and thought them the size of galleys. When Vermithor's shadow passed over the harbor that afternoon, it was a whole fleet, and the novices had shouted like boys at a cockfight despite themselves. Read, said the seneschal. Tell me what the Bravosi write, and do not color it with your thoughts. The Bravosi do not say their thoughts in ink, Edric said with a proud impudence that made the seneschal's mouth flatten. They say their boats in harbors, but this says that they will not trade in any port under Valyrian flame. They say that the secret city has no quarrel with Old Town, but they have a quarrel with Dragonstone. They call it by an old name, a rock among bones. The seneschal's hood tipped. They are not wrong, but their quarrel is older still. When the singers say that the Rhoyne sang for the last time, it was those 14 flames that taught it fear. Bravos was built from fearful men and women who learned to hide their fear behind price. They will not forgive. Read more. Edric read. From beyond the honey wine scent of bees and salt, words rose like fog. Trades threatened, debts called, Ships redirected from the Arbor's golden wines to Lys's sweet syrup, to Tyrosh's green pearl farms. Old Town's light, which every sailor from the summer sea to the Jade Gates called his compass, faced a shadow the light could not burn away. "Do you fear these?" the novice asked at last, when his voice had grown dry. "Dragons? Bravos? Which will make Old Town's lamps burn lower?" "The lamps burn because we fill them," the seneschal said, which was both answer and lesson. "Fear the one that empties our oil. Bravos likes war when it bleeds Valyria. The freehold likes peace when it fattens Valyria. Tell me, novice, which will cost us more?" Edric thought of the harbor and its coin speech. "Peace," he said reluctantly. "If it is Valyrian peace." The seneschal made a faint sound that might have been approval. "Then light more lamps," he said. North of Old Town, the world changed its colors. Rivers went brown and quick under cloud. The air smelled not of brine but of damp earth and leaf. Lord Heron the Black watched winter crows rise in a wheeling punctuation from the half-finished towers of his monstrous castle. Harrenhal was a simile that did not end. It was always like something. A fist, a broken harp, a giant trying to stand. The masons heaved stones like mountains onto sledges. The laborers groaned beneath them. The lake shivered with a wind that came out of the west like a doctrine. "More lime," he said. "I want the mortar to set before the equinox, and send word to Seagard. I want their featherbed lord to hear that a dragon has taken Dragonstone for more than sleeping." His son, skinny and unhandsome in a way that bespoke a lineage that ate itself with ambition and forgot nourishment, shifted at his shoulder. "If a dragon comes," Gwaine said in a voice he tried to make iron, "we'll put arrows in its eyes. We will build scorpions on the battlements." "Do you intend to stand on the walls with the men?" Heron asked without looking at him. "Or will you write the scorpions' names in your book and call them your friends?" Gwaine colored. "I will stand, but we have to think, father. Valyria protected Dragonstone for a century without bothering to press farther. Why now? Why now?" Heron repeated softly, savoring the words. He looked over the lake, in which the sky was cupped in gray hands. "Because I have been building this for too long. Because Argilac the arrogant has not fallen. Because the gardeners think their vines will hold the walls up while the roots rot. Because the Lannister lion lies in summer grass with his belly full. Because the Starks sit their cold chairs and dream their old gods to life, and when they wake they will find iron and be surprised. Because of you," Gwaine said bluntly. "Because of me," Heron agreed, and now he looked at his son. "Because men like Bravos better than a king they cannot bend. Because the freehold would rather count our coins than kill our sons. Because I have made wars that did not end. The freehold hates wars that do not end. They spoil markets. And if the freehold comes to Westeros, it will be to sell us peace, with dragons as its coin. So we must buy a different coin." Heron's smile was slow and without warmth. "Or counterfeit the freehold's currency. Fetch me Lord Horsemaster. I would hear what he has written of Dragonstone, and what he has been paid not to write." At the wall, a week after a storm wrote its name across the sky in lightning, a raven landed with black feet among the Black Brothers. It shook the rain out of its feathers like pieces of night and croaked 2 coarse notes before thrusting its head into the wooden bowl of grains. A boy with a scar on his lip, Benjen Snow, though he would outgrow both scar and name if life allowed, held out a pebble and the bird pecked it, suspicious, then discarded it with disdain. The raven came with letters, and the letters came with worlds beyond the wall, worlds of dragon and trade. The Lord Commander, whose beard had gone white as the wind, read aloud for the men whose letters were the wind. Lords in the south were speaking of a queen without a sept, of gods that were not gods but long bones warmed, of coins stamped with a fire lily men called Valyrian, which were worth twice what men thought any coin ought to be worth because they believed they would be tomorrow what they were today. "Dragons?" asked a brother who had stitched battle scars across his face in a pattern like bad writing. "Do they fly so far north?" "They fly as far as Rumor," the Lord Commander said, "and Rumor loves cold places. Men will tell themselves any story to keep warm. Benjen stood on the top of the wall at midnight and thought of those fires. He imagined scales like hammered kettles. He imagined heat on his cheeks. He imagined the smell of something older than trees, but it was only the smell of old snow, which is a smell like old paper, yellowed and fibrous. He held out his hand into the dark and felt flakes kiss it and vanish. The North would not love dragons. It would not love anything that might melt its edges and turn everything into something else. In Sunspear, often as far from winter as a man could go without stepping into a furnace, Princess Larisa Martell stood in the upper gallery where winter did not take its language. There the wind pronounced itself differently. It came off the stepstones smelling of warm limestone and the ghost of crushed time, and it carried with it stories of galleys and corsairs, of caravans unloading at Planky Town, of the sound of brazen bells in the streets of Tyrosh and painted men drunk on arbor gold. Larisa listened. She had the habit of a scorpion, stillness gatherer of heat. She had learned from old women how to hear the future rustle in palm fronds. She heard it now. The footfall of an empire that had taken her people's mothers from the riverbanks and burned their cities until their bricks were glass. Valyria comes, she said to her captain, who wore rings of gold on his upper arm that made his skin shine darker. Not with whips this time, with scrolls. They will find the whips, the captain said, if they return to Dorne. They will, if the other kingdoms argue long enough. The Reach will welcome them because the Hightowers want their light reflected in dragon eyes. The Lannisters will weigh dragons on scales and decide they cannot afford to hate them. Argilac will beat his chest and demand that dragons kneel. Harren will tell himself his walls have learned to bite. The Starks will count their snows. The Vale will polish its eagles and think this has nothing to do with them. And Dorne remembers. We do, she said. She touched the old hunting scar on her shoulder that she wore without shame, the faint sunburst of pale lines against gold skin. We remember Nymeria. We remember being told we were dust in men's teeth. We remember the river singing and then coughing. We will not open our ports to Valyria, but we will open our ears. If dragons are coming, I will hear them before they breathe. Across the narrow sea, a city that had been taught by fear to call itself the secret city boiled very quietly with decisions. Bravos measured its choices in oars, and 1,000 oars beat the Greenblood's skin in old songs. In the palace of the Sea Lord, which looked like a ship come to rest upon stone, the first sword polished his blade with a strip of oiled leather while the Sea Lord read a letter and the keyholders of the Iron Bank pretended they were only counting money. They proposed to forbid Braavosi from trading in any port with a Valyrian governor. The keyholder with a mole on his jaw said mildly, "A boy's idea of policy. Too clean. Too hard." "Boys are useful," said the Sea Lord. "They throw stones that crack old jars. The wine inside spills, and then men drink it." The first sword tested the razor's edge with his thumb and smiled when it cut him. "Dragons do not drink wine," he said. "They drink the sound you make when you think you will die." Bravos can kill men. Can it kill dragons? Bravos can bankrupt men, the keyholder said. Dragons do not read notes, but men who ride dragons do. A silence. The Sea Lord's ring, shaped like a tiny ship, tapped the table once. "We will not meet dragons with arrows," he said. "We will meet them with debts. Let the Reach take Valyrian coin. We will buy its debts. Let Dragonstone lend to Old Town. We will own Old Town's grain by autumn. We will not forbid trade in Valyrian ports. We will buy it. We will make their peace cost more than our war. How shall we pay the cost of a war we may yet fight?" The first sword asked quietly. "Wit. Men who understand cost," said the keyholder. "There are many men in Westeros who do not love their kings. In King's Landing, where no king ruled because the city had never been asked to wear a crown, but where king's quarrels were weighed into coin and spent like water down the gutters, a girl with ash in her hair listened to sailors speak of dragons. Her name was Maris, and she sold oysters from a tray that hung from her shoulders, and her voice could cut a dockhand's hand from a purse without touching it. When the first Valyrian ship anchored with banners like tongues of green fire, she set her tray down on a bollard and let the crowd lift her. She stood on a scrape of rope and watched as the black armored figures came ashore with their helmets crested like flames, their cloaks caught on the wind like sails. She had heard that the dragon lords had hair like moonlight. These did not. Some had hair like straw, some like iron, some like honey. Their commander had hair black as the rocks of Dragonstone and eyes the color of winter. When he turned his head, it was like a thing with two necks. The dragon stitched on his cloak looked the other way. "Buy?" she said in her best sing-song. "Oysters? Clams? Cockles?" Her voice rang like a bell against a helmet and came back to her. One of the dragon men reached for an oyster with the casualness of men who had never paid for anything with their own money. She slapped his hand. He stopped, astonished, then laughed, tossed her a coin whose weight was odd, heavy as two. She bit it, tasted of nobody she knew. She kept it. They spoke low to a harbor master who had been a tyrant until that morning, when he learned that there are tyrants and then there are dragons. Papers were shown, unrolled, pressed with green wax. Men bowed and told themselves they weren't. Women looked and told themselves they did not. A Valyrian quarter was marked on a map and then walked upon, staked. The city changed without moving. A black gull wheeled out over the black water and the water's skin dimpled where a fish rose. The gull hung on the air for a wondrous instant as if nailed there by invisible craft and then fell upon its prize. Maris watched it, thinking of invisible things. She put the Valyrian coin in the lining of her boot. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra drafted a letter to Oldtown that contained a promise, and to Casterly Rock that contained a compliment that Lannisters would recognize as a purchase price, and to Sunspear that contained a respect old as ash. She wrote to the Eyrie, which replied in careful sentences that said, "We are above this." She did not write to Winterfell, which replied to nothing in summer. She wrote to Lord Harren because she knew it would annoy him. It did. He opened the letter in his unfinished hall with a knife he used for meat, and as he read it his lip curled to show a hint of the boy he had been, eager to be brutal lest he be thought soft. "She wants a safe conduct to pass the trident with her dragon," he said. "For a visit. A visit." Gwaine shifted, hopeful. "To where?" "To be seen," Harren said. His voice was a rasp. "To look down upon my walls and know themselves like stones beside mountains. She will not burn Harrenhal. She needs its shadow to frighten the river lords into her open hands. But she will make a ring in my sky. She will not leave men to doubt which coin spends truer. Send back word that she may fly over my lands. Send it with a gift, fat stag, a barrel of strong ale, and put 1,000 men in the fields with polished shields to reflect her and blind her as she passes." Rhaenyra 80 leagues away smiled when the answer came. The stag was fat indeed. The ale was excellent. Over-refinement often believes itself invisible. She paid for both with coin and grace and rose before dawn 2 days later, Vermithor's wings beating the morning into shape. They crossed the crownlands in a long glide that set shepherds to their knees and boys to their feet. At the trident the world spread a map beneath them, its blue forks like fingers holding a secret. Vermithor roared once for pleasure and once for warning. Rhaenyra's hair was plaited in the old style with silver rings that sang occasionally when the wind struck them. When the fields rolled into view, she saw the 1,000 shields with their polished faces tilt, and she laughed aloud. Harren painted the sky. She painted it back. Vermithor wheeled in an arc that carved a sun in the air. His belly caught the light and blazed, and Rhaenyra tugged the rein so his tail cut a letter that only men with imagination would read. Her shadow ran over men's open mouths, and she smelled the tense awe that is more intoxicating than fear. She rode that moment as she rode the dragon, heel light, eyes full of the line she meant to draw. Then she saw beyond the 1,000 shields the scaffolding and the half-lived towers and the lake. She felt the pull of something that was not entirely ambition. A craftsman's interest in another craftsman's madness. Harrenhal almost wanted to be beautiful. It almost wanted to admit that beauty and pride kiss too often to be unrelated. She banked closer, felt the belly heat of her mount swell as old instincts stung him. Vermithor had burned fortresses. Rhaenyra had told him not to. The old memory stirred in him like the stirring of oak roots under spring rain. She laid her palm flat on his neck and pressed wool through it like warmth through wool. "Do not," she said softly. "This is no war." Men in polished helms looked up with their eyes like coins, interchangeable, minted fear. The dragon's shadow and the keep's shadow met and made a shade that was almost cool. On the half-built tower, a figure stood like a nail hammered through the sky. If that was Heron, he was a man who understood his own weight. He did not flinch. He did not raise his hand. He simply watched the dragon pass and go and become nothing but a story he would use for his purpose. When they Ned back east, Vermithor's labor making the morning tremble. Rhaenyra saw on the horizon the wink of sun on a thin line of ships. She lifted herself in the saddle to look, old habit mutilated by curiosity, and made out the flat, low shape of Braavosi galleys, the compact, hungry geometry of them. They were not in the river. They were outside where they could move. "Bravos," she said to the dragon in the language that was no language. He beat his wings once, twice, as if the thought were a hill. Bravos moved in ways that did not disturb water. Letters arrived in Old Town whose ink looked as if it had dried before it was written. Money moved like a fig leaf over a giant's shame. Lannister merchants found that if they wanted to sell to certain towns in the east, they must sell for 6 months on credit. The credit came from Bravos, and the debt belonged in fine to the Lannisters. The Hightowers found their wine prices held firm in winter and somehow continually neglected to rise in summer. The Iron Bank made a loan to the Watch at Eastwatch by the Sea, which had never before borrowed more than a goose, and demanded its collateral in timber rights on 3 northern forests that men said were haunted. If the Starks noticed, they said nothing with words. Dorne's letter to Dragonstone was courteous and made of steel. It acknowledged Rhaenyra's courtesy and made Dorne's refusal gleam with the sort of pride that would look like petulance to men who liked to conquer. Said, "We bleed more slowly than you burn." Said, "We have burned." Said, "We can do both." When Rhaenyra read it, she smiled and tasted brine. She could not decide if she loved or hated people who wrote so purely. The first true smoke blew when a Lysine slaver whelped on the step of the Valyrian quarter in King's Landing, and a boy with the wrong mother and the right rage put a knife in his belly. He did not do it because the man was a slaver. He did it because the coin in his purse was not a coin he recognized, and because the man had told a girl in the gutter that her mouth was worth a copper, and the boy had decided it was worth a silver. When the slaver died, he made a noise that sounded like a pot boiling over, and in the silence that followed, the Valyrian guards made a line with their shields, and the city watched through a veil woven of salt and sweat. Rhaenyra went herself because she would not let some captain or clerk bleed the meaning out of the moment. Vermithor landed in a basin of stone the size of a gladiator's hallucination. His claws clicked on the cobbles. The dragon's heat pressed the smell of rotting fish and stale piss out of the alleyways like hands wringing a rag. The boy was on his knees. He had washed his knife in a puddle until the water was the color of gulls' cries. "What is your name?" she asked, looking down at a creature that could have been 1,000 things if his birth had turned its head an inch. "Maris," said the boy before the boy corrected him. "He is Maris's brother," the girl said, standing with her tray empty and a streak on her cheek where she had wiped it with a fish hand. "He is no one. He is mine." Rhaenyra looked at the slaver's blood doing its old work of becoming dirt. The city held its breath. "Slavery is forbidden in the quarter," she said. "We were not in the quarter," the captain of her guard said smoothly, his Valyrian making the words like a door closing. Rhaenyra did not look at him. "Slavery is forbidden wherever my banners fly," she said instead. And now she looked at the crowd and the crowd looked back. "And if my banners fly over alleys where I cannot stop a man from putting a price on another's mouth, then my banners do not fly there at all. I will not do half-laws. Take the body. Burn it at the cost of his guild. Send word to Lys that their slavers are not welcome in Valyrian harbors that touch Westerosi keys. And you, Maris's brother, keep your sister from knives and men who think knives are the only way to count a woman's worth." The boy blinked. "How?" "By outliving them," she said, and tossed him the coin that should have been his payment. He caught it without grace and with a steadiness that made her think. "He will." The word went along the dock like a tide that changes, and men do not notice until their feet are wet. It lapped at the high tower in Old Town, and at the 7 statues where the faith militant listened with sunlight on their helms, and at Casterly Rock where Lord Tywald Lannister smiled in a way that bared his teeth. It splashed against Sunspear, where Princess Lyriza rolled a small bone dice in her palm and thought of the day Nymeria had burned her fleet. It made a faint damp shine on the stones of Harrenhal, and Harren sniffed like a man who can smell rain half a country away. The first man to die because of that decision was not a slaver, but a clerk. He had been born in Pentos with crooked fingers, and they had made him a clerk because he could not grip a sword. He kept the ledger of certain small Valyrian law courts that awarded damages. He wrote in neat, dry lines. He had a wife who loved to eat green figs and take the stiffness from his fingers with oil. He happened to be on the dock that day with a satchel full of sealed orders that would carry the ban against slavers to the right ears. He was stabbed with a whaler's spike in the soft place where his bookishness had left no armor. The man who stabbed him was killed by the crowd because crowds have their own arithmetic. The orders disappeared in the chaos, and the band took 3 more days to reach Lys. In those 3 days, a Lysine captain, whose name no one now remembers, took on cargo from the Stepstones that was not cargo. The wind was fair. The ship sailed. Its shadow crossed the gardener's shore at dusk and was gone. "War," said the Hightower's lord, not loudly, to his maester when the news came. "Smells like a ledger that will not balance, not like blood." The maester was Maester A. Lester, who had brought Rhaenyra words on his staff like bells. He watched Old Town's harbor as if it were an astrolabe. "If it is war," he said, "it is also a bargain. Valyria has made herself less horrible. Braavos has made itself more costly. The faith has made itself braver by letting men put on swords again. Somebody will pay. Who would you prefer?" "Not me," said the Hightower, and smiled his old gentle smile that had never fooled any man who counted coin. "Send for the gardeners. And send for Lady Rhaenyra. Tell her we are ready to write what we have already done." In the north, the letter came slower, as if the ink had to thaw between each word. It came to Winterfell carried by a man painted with sleet. Lord Torrhen Stark opened it with fingers that had not lost their summer yet and read with eyes that belonged to another season. The letter spoke in Rhaenyra's voice, or perhaps she had learned to write like a northerner, without boasting, without apology. It said, "I will not bring chains." It said, "I will forbid chains in any place where my law is law." It said, "You may keep your gods." It said, "I ask only lanes for ships and men to guard them. I ask scouts upon the king's roads who will look for men who would burn wagons and call it sovereignty. I ask to speak with you." Lord Torrhen looked at the hearth and thought of men called Dragon Kings. He thought of the pact that had once been made under the weirwoods that whispered when no wind moved. He thought of the long winter coming not in months but in the way a man thinks of dying, when he is very young and when he is very old and always when he is alone. He sent for his sister. "Winter comes," she said when she had read the letter. "Always, but sometimes it brings a different wind with it. What would you advise?" he asked, not because he did not know but because she was wise. "Speak to her," she said. "Don't kneel." "I am not Harren," he said, which was both an assurance and an insult. He could not help the smile that made. "She is not Argilac," she said. "That is what worries me." He sent ravens. He set tables. He hung blankets across certain doorways so the warmth of their talk would not leak into the stone and become a memory for the mice. When Rhaenyra came, she came on a day of thin sunlight and spoke first in the courtyard to the hounds. The hounds decided they would not mind her. Her dragon crouched in the godswood, and the trees accepted him because trees do not mind old things. "You will forbid slavery where your law runs," Torrhen said when they had sat and drunk the warm beer of Winterfell, which Rhaenyra did not pretend to like, and eaten the turned sausages of Winterfell, which she did. "I have," she said. "You will collect taxes." "I will collect tariffs," she corrected, "and fines, and I will hire ships to protect your ships with them. I will not take your sons. I have dragons." He nodded. "You will ask for nothing else." "I will not ask," she said, which was clever. Because I will come again. When your men grow accustomed to dragons on the horizon, they will begin to ask, why do we not have a share of this? Why do we not have cheaper rye from Bravos and better wine from the arbor and iron from the east that does not crack? They will ask, and you will answer them, because you are Lord. You will say, because I told the dragon lady to take her smoke and go. Or you will say, because I welcomed her under a law that forbade the worst things. Either way, you will answer, I merely offer you which words you will prefer to say. You are not Argilac, he said, smiling despite himself. No, she said. Her eyes were winter water. I am not. They made a bargain and their hands were dry. The bottle in which they sealed it was old and held an odor of apples. She slept under a roof that did not quite understand her weight and did not mind. Vermithor slept with his chin on a drift of old leaves and dreamed of fire that did not singe anything that mattered. He dreamed of a red river and men shouting, and then he dreamed of a black bay in which lights moved like fish. In King's Landing, where lamps burned because men stole the oil, Maris sat with her tray against a wall of warm brick and counted coins. She licked her thumb as if it held the sea and turned them on the tray's wood and made little lines to keep her sums true. The Valyrian coin sat alone like a lord who had paid for a room and would not share it. She did not yet know she would need it for the dead man. The dead man was not a man. He was a way of speaking, like calling disease a visitor. He moved with the wind off ships. He tossed men's lives on his palm and weighed them with an absent air, as if he were thinking of the weather. When Bravos bought the dented silver that paid the city watch for 3 months and the city's debt to the Tyroshi gamblers for 3 years, the dead man came in with the sea and told the watchmen they would be paid if they watched certain corners more carefully than others. He told the gamblers they would be paid if they stopped lending to certain men. It was subtle work, like walking on a rope. Men fell, some because they were greedy, some because they did not understand when a city changed coin. The first true dragonfire in Westeros since the dawn of the first men rose not against a keep, nor a field, but against a ship. It was a Lysine ship that thought to test the edges of the new law and draw a circle around it with a crew of whores and chained boys and one clever attorney who thought a port was a port and a quarter was a quarter. They anchored in black night, stealthy as sin, under the bluff that hid the Valyrian quarter from the rest of the city. Men with rope arms pulled on oars that had no voices. Then the air grew hot. It grew hot in a way no man can argue with, and then it became light. The dragonfire came down in a slow, terrible arc like a god's eye closing. It did not roar. It hummed, a deep dreaming hum that jarred. Men's bones. When it struck the deck, the world went green. In the morning, ashes floated like sixpences. Men scooped them onto their tongues and said they tasted of copper. Rhaenyra watched the water carry the sting away. She had not slept. Vermithor blinked in the first light as if waking had to happen twice. She thought she would hate herself. She found she did not. She had warned. She had written. She had paid with a clerk's life for 3 days. She had measured the cost. The cost had been measured for her in screams at the Rhoyne. A dragon does not weep when it warms its egg. The faith rose, as perhaps it had been waiting to rise. The warriors' sons marched in leather that smelled of oil and forgiveness. The poor fellows marched in boots that stank of barley and rain. They shouted homilies that felt like promises. Some were promises. The High Septon called dragons an affront to heaven. He called chains an affront to heaven. He called the city's gutters affronts to heaven. And the way men could not afford to buy a loaf of bread because coins were being counted elsewhere and not here. The Seven's faces in the sept listened and did not blink. Rhaenyra went to the sept and did not kneel. She spoke to the High Septon at the door. I forbid chains, she said. I will not forbid ships. The freehold has come to sell you all you want that you cannot grow. We grow faith, he said gently. He was an old man with a mouth that drooped as if it held honey and did not like to spill it. And law, and peace. We can grow coin too with time, if we do not bind ourselves to those who have more of it than we shall ever see. Your law does not keep raiders off the Mander, she said. Your law does not keep men from buying men, he said. You can call it Lysine and say you do not import it. but it stinks in our alleys." She might have said 1,000 things. She said only, "Watch." In Harrenhal, Harren watched. He watched the faith grow brave and then slow under the weight of feeding itself. He watched Bravos tighten its strings and Old Town loosen theirs. He watched Lannister gold flow toward Valyrian ships because money is a river that seeks the sea. He watched the Ironborn watching him, and he watched his masons die under stones. He sent his son to the Vale to speak of eagles. He sent his bastard to King's Landing to speak of oysters. He wrote a letter to Rhaenyra that said, "You will not pass my lake again without a toll." She wrote back, "I already paid for my view." He sent her a barrel of ale that tasted of smoke and cherries and a small girl with hair the exact yellow of straw in summer. She sent the ale back and the girl with it and a note that said, "Keep your daughters." "War," he said at last. "If it must be, let it be mine." It began in the Riverlands because everything began in the Riverlands if it was messy. A convoy of 30 supply carts bound north for the forts beyond the Neck rolled out of a Valyrian-protected harbor under the eyes of 4 mounted guards, 2 hired archers, and 12 teamsters whose whips slapped the morning like sneers. They carried cloth, salt cod, barley bread, new iron nails, a cartload of wine for some northern lord with taste and connections, and a chest of coins to pay wages. The carts did not carry armies. They carried the suggestion of armies. They carried the idea that roads were safe if Valyria said they were. Half a day out, under a stand of birches that looked like ladies slipping their dresses over pale shoulders, the bandits came. They were not desperate men. They were men who had eaten recently and wanted to keep on doing it. They were Riverlords' cousins, and they were knights who had not been paid in full, and they were men who used to take their share as tax and now took it as an insult. They fell upon the convoy and killed its licensed killers and took the chests and broke the barrels with friendly letters. One of them cut the tongues out of the horses because he had been insulted by a master teamster once and had a long memory. The road remembered the blood as if it were water that had not yet learned its place. When the first news reached Dragonstone, it was old, as such news always is. It was a story told by a boy with a gooseberry stain on his mouth 3 days to the east, who had smelled wine on the wind and thought he had died and gone to a richer place. Then it came by raven from a lord whose name did not matter and whose conscience did. Then it came in coin. None of the guards were Valyrian, but the chest was. The loss stung in a way that had nothing to do with numbers. Rhaenyra went to the river with Vermithor and 50 mounted men with arrows that had been chosen for the sound they made. They ran quieter than wolves. Men watched them come and made calculations in their heads as quick and inexact as love. She found the birches. She found the place where the horses' tongues had lain like little red fish. She found the wine. It had soaked the dirt and the dirt had liked it. She set guards on the road and sent for the lords who would claim they had known nothing. 2 came. One sent his second son. One sent a poet. "The roads are yours to keep," Lord Smallwood said, making his voice full of grievance and common sense. "You have claimed them. Keep them. The roads are yours to use," Rhaenyra said, making her voice full of something he would call condescension. "Use them." The poet wrote lines about a dragon under trees that made the dragon sound like sunlight. The second son watched Vermithor with admiration so pure it originated no danger. Smallwood named bandits who would not be found. Rhaenyra went to the next village and the next, and the oil of news spread. Harren lifted his head and sniffed. "Now," he said, and in that moment he was beautiful. "Now they will draw their swords." The swords that drew first had faith on their pommels. The poor fellows swarmed a Valyrian wagon train that contained nothing but cloth and pride, and tore pride smaller than cloth tears. Rhaenyra burned the shed where they had slept afterwards, empty, because sometimes law must make a gesture. Men who had loved her for forbidding chains hated her for burning a shed. Men who had hated her for being an emblem loved her for being an emblem of change. Men are complicated. They speak with their bellies, and their bellies speak of memory. Letters flew. In Old Town, Maester Alistair tied strings to maps. In the Rock, Lord Lannister filed his nails with a tiny knife and wrote to Valyria in a hand that implied he had been weaned on wine and desserts. In Sunspear, Larisa sent spears north who knew how to walk without sound and how to lie with truth. In Winterfell, Torrhen sharpened the word no and set it aside very carefully where he would not give it away. In Bravos, the keyholders changed an interest rate by 1 point and sent a girl with a face like anyone's to King's Landing. The girl found Maris counting coins behind a pile of oyster shells and said, "You will follow me, and you will forget my face, and you will remember everything else." Maris, who had learned the arithmetic of fear before she learned the arithmetic of oysters, did both. She ended that day with a new coin in her boot and a new understanding of the word debt. She understood that it did not mean owing money. It meant owing a story to someone who could tell it about you loudly. Lord Harren's campaign was clever. He did not attack Dragonstone. He interdicted lanes. He paid men with no banners to steal wagons with banners. He offered harbor fees to those who asked none too many questions. He created chaos at a price he thought he could pay. He did not burn a single Valyrian. He thought this was wisdom. He forgot that the freehold measured damage not in bodies but in routes that did not deliver what they promised. He made a book of small injuries. He thought the total would never be large enough to summon fire. Rhaenyra understood sums. She went to Old Town and sat with the Hightower. Together, with words that moved like lantern light, they wrote law, harbor law, escort law. The Faith signed half of it and refused half, and the half they refused mattered more to their pride than to the ships. Bravos squeezed. Lannisters leveraged. Dorne watched. Then a ship burned at anchor in the Whispering Sound without any dragon within 100 leagues. It burned the way a man burns when the thing that lights him is his own breath. The sailors jumped into the water and flailed with the strength of men who do not like to believe in worse things than drowning. When they were pulled out, they spoke of a whisper that had sounded like a voice they knew. They said the ship had been blessed by a red priest in Lys who smiled like a candle flame. They said the fire had smiled back. Old Town tightened its hand on its lantern, and the citadel whispered in corners in voices that were priestlier than they liked. Rhaenyra stood on the quay and watched the last beam cave in with a sigh like a bed accepting a weight, and she said very low, "Cohor," because she was thinking of secrets hammered into steel. The battle that was not yet called a war fought itself in courts and in counting houses, in alleys and on the Trident's banks, with quiet knives and loud sermons. The first great fire waited until men thought perhaps there would not be one. It came when Lord Harren's men, 7 good ones, for they were not fools, finally misjudged which small cut was too much and tried to take a convoy under Vermithor's shadow. They chose dusk. They chose rain. They chose a strip of road that ran between 2 swamps that looked like sleeping cattle. They chose well. They were river men. They had numbers. They had hooks on ropes and a cart they set ablaze and sent rolling backward into the convoy with a man screaming on top of it to make panic run faster. Rhaenyra was not there. She had been pulled away by politics that smelled of holly and wax. The convoy's captain was a Lysene who had learned to love rules in a city where rules were written to be folded. He kept his head. He told the archers to shoot the ropes and did not look at the man on the cart. He had a trumpet blow in the pattern Vermithor knew when he was a young, mean beast, 3 short, 1 long. He prayed to a god he had almost forgotten, that the dragon remembered. Vermithor remembered. The dragon came out of cloud like a thought finishing itself, and the bandits almost dropped their ropes in gratitude. The dragon beat his wings once and the torches went dark, which was a trick, and lit again, which was not. Rain steamed, oily water hissed and crackled on his scales. He opened his mouth and a long line of fire unrolled like a document. It struck the road in a line that cut it between carts and men. Curved, turned back. It drew a sigil in fire the way men draw them in ink. Said, "Stop." The fire did not leap from man to man. It did not engulf. It was the most precise thing anyone saw, and after saw dreamed about, and after dreamed about swore had been chance. A man with a rope in his hand and terror in his mouth looked down at it and decided, for the second time in his life, to drop something. The first had been a child. This was easier. He ran. Others ran with him because running spreads like disease, and then when disease reaches certain numbers, it stops. Some stayed and fought because they did not believe they must run. Vermithor put the full of his gaze on them, which was like putting the full sun on snow. They melted. Rhaenyra arrived too late to do anything but count her losses and decide on her next letter. She wrote to Harren and said, "If you must be clever, be less clever." He did not write back. In the months that followed, the freehold took Westeros by inches. It learned its streams and its priests. It learned what windows would open in a city and which would not. It learned that the Stark word was a tundra of truth and that the Lonnist, her word, was a coin that always had two faces. It learned that the mart of Old Town could be led by its nose to a ledger that ended in songs. It learned that the Vale liked to pretend it was an island. It learned that Dorne had scars that did not blush. It learned that the faith would bear insult until it could not, and that when it could not, it would shatter on you like glass and embed itself in your skin for years. Westeros learned Valyria too. It learned that dragons were not kings but tools. It learned that law written in old Volantene curls could keep a wharfman fed if enforced by a man with ordinary feet. It learned that coins could come from a bank the size of a city and be traded for bread in a market the size of a lane. It learned that men who outlaw slavery in the quarter may enforce laws in the alley where no quarter lies. It learned that the debt man comes in on the tide and that the tide goes out. Maris learned to walk in the Valyrian quarter and to say 3 words in their language that bought her twice the oysters. She learned to hear a dragon in her bones before any man saw it. She learned not to look up when the guards marched, because they did not like to find their eyes meeting eyes. She learned the names of men who would live. Benjen on the wall learned to watch the sky for dragons and the snow for older things, and to hold in his head 2 truths that did not get along. That the world was changing in the south, and that the north did not care, and that the north would pay for not caring. He learned to make friends with crows and to listen. He wrote a letter once to Winterfell. "They are making peace with fire. Be careful it does not warm too much." Lyriza in Sunspear watched the first Valyrian envoy enter her hall with a flow of silks and the flanked swagger of a man used to being feared, and she smiled like a cat that has learned the geography of her house. "We do not kneel," she said. "We bow. We do not bend. We curve. We do not burn. We scorch." The envoy went away with lines on his palm from where he had gripped himself too hard. Lord Harren died, as men do. He died not in battle but in the dark, smelling of mortar and cold, looking at stones he had kissed with pride. He died because he had made too many small wars and had weighed each coin they cost and had been wronged by a grain that grew. His castle did not melt. His sons did. Their names poured out of the riverlands like water from a cracked pail. Harrenhal stood, a map of a man's soul, unfinished in its perfection. Rhaenyra grew old, which surprised her. She made law. She made enemies that did not kill her and friends that did not betray her, and both categories remained on her books until after her hair went to frost. She watched Vermithor sleep longer and wake more slowly and rise with a complaint in his wing that she felt in her shoulder a day later. She went to Winterfell twice and to Old Town 7 times and to King's Landing whenever the light on Blackwater Bay looked like a promise. She forbade chains until men forgot they had been permitted in some places. She thought, occasionally, of the doom that had not happened and the world that had happened instead, and she found that she did not mourn it. Power that destroys itself is efficient. Power that endures is art. The freehold did not conquer Westeros. It learned it, and in learning it changed. A law written on Dragonstone forbidding any man to be bought on that rock spread, by slow polite degrees, to a law forbidding the sale of men in any port that traded with it. A priest in Old Town who had shouted against dragons held his tongue when 3 ships full of bread came in midwinter under their protection. The faith militant disbanded because men could not decide whether to kill those who brought them food. Bravos became a whisper instead of a shout in King's Landing when the debt man found Maris would only attend to oysters and those whose bellies contained them. Dorne did not sign any paper and did not bend any knee, and yet woke one morning to find that Valyrian ships came to Planky Town without banners and left with dates and silk that had been paid for with stories. There were fires. There were knives. There were poems. There were laws. There were long winters in which dragons breathed steam and stood like stones while the wind tried to find what it could not freeze. There was an old woman in King's Landing who told her grandson once, when he asked what it had been like, that it was like a very careful fire in a very dry house. "What kept it from burning it down?" the boy asked. "Men who liked the house," she said, "and women who knew where the water was, and dragons that learned to warm their eggs without killing the hens." She died with a coin in her boot and a tray in her lap, because some habits are also loves. The coin was Valyrian and worth more than her life if you count such things. Her grandson did not sell it. He took it to the sept and laid it at the warrior's feet and said a prayer he had made up. The priest asked him afterward why he chose the warrior. "Because warriors have to measure," he said. "They can't cut at everything. They have to choose." The priest smiled. "So do dragons," he said. High in the winter sky, Vermithor lifted his head to a sun that had just then found a hole in clouds and held it there, letting the light soak his old scales. Rhaenyra stood at the edge of a cliff so cold that her tears would have frozen if she had let them be seen. The dragon breathed, and the air folded as if it were tired and had lain down. Below, the narrow sea lay unbroken, and upon it ships moved like sentences in a book written very long ago that men were still adding to, with care and smudges and the occasional flourish that made readers laugh or gasp or throw the book and say, "That did not happen." And yet, when they looked back, it had. Snow came early to Winterfell that year, a sift of soft knives that whispered against hutters and made men thoughtful. Rhaenyra stood under a lintel blackened by torches and breathed workmanlike cold, while Vermithor dozed in a grove of pines that had long ago given up needles on their north faces. She had intended to stay a day, 2 at the most. She stayed 7 because Torrhen had questions that mattered and because the north tested what people said by leaving silence after it and seeing what still stood. They spoke in the great hall with its smoke-darkened beams and the long tables sheened with old tallow. The wolf banners hung as if they had never learned to move. Torrhen came to the point as a man with a long road behind him and a longer ahead. He asked what she would do when the Red Priests set fire to ideas and called the flames gods. She told him she would put out fires that were not in hearths. He asked what she would do when bravos bought the wages of men who watched for thieves and told them which thieves to see. She told him she would shine a light until thieves preferred to be seen by her. He asked what she would do when winter made ships slow and dragons slower and men hungry and law thin. She told him she would send ships before winter, and she would store grain under her own banners and be judged by whether her stores opened to others before her own men's mouths were filled. He watched her mouth while she spoke, as if truth could be seen there. "You speak like a man who has lost," he said at last. "I speak like a woman who has watched a river flood and found that shouting at water is stupid," she answered. "The water will go where it wishes. Law must be stones that teach it a path and do not break under it." He smiled, the small winter smile of a Stark. A crack in ice that promised the river still moved under it. "And dragons. Dragons are sons we borrow," she said. "If we forget that, they burn us." He nodded. He took her to the crypts the next morning. The women of Winterfell do not fear the cold the way Southerners do. They have arranged their souls to wear it like wool. She stood among stone lords whose hands held stone swords and felt the oldness of a thing that had not been burned and rebuilt a dozen times. The air tasted of damp earth and iron. Torrhen's sister, whose mouth could section a lie like a fishwife sections a mackerel, walked with them and said nothing until they had come again to the steps. "You were afraid in the dark," she said to Rhaenyra without superiority, simply as if stating the color of a cloak. "I am always afraid in the dark," Rhaenyra said. "It is why I like fire." Vermithor climbed into the sky when they left, laden with frost, and shook himself of it as geese do water. The north let them go with no sound but the soft tearing of snow under claw and the breath of men below, and the news traveled slower than the dragon did, that there had been courtesy and meat and a bargain that felt like winter light on ice. Between Old Town's lantern and Winterfell's hearth lay a strip of kingdoms that had not yet decided how to feel about being decided for. In the Vale, the Arryn sent a letter that praised the beauty of dragons the way men praise a painting, in sentences that had a careful distance in them. In Casterly Rock, Lord Tywald set down a cup of arbor gold and said aloud to no one that the sound the sea made in his caves had begun to resemble the murmur of coin. He wrote to Dragonstone and to Braavos and never put the two letters next to each other, not even when he sealed them, lest the wax learn a secret. In the Stormlands, Argilac the Arrogant trained in rain without a cloak, because men watched him, and a long spear glittered through the gray like the spine of something that had learned to straighten itself under wind. He said he would not be told what toll his own roads would take by a woman who came out of a rock. He sent word to river lords who listened when thunder talked. He sent meat to Haren's funeral and promised wine to his sons, who found themselves dead before they could drink it. Haren's eldest died of a cold that turned wrong, as often pride does in marshland. The second bled out in a brawl that had begun with a laugh. The third put on a crown of reeds and lost his head when a cousin decided the same crown fit him better. Haren's bastards multiplied like gossip until men could not agree which story had the sharpest ending. Harrenhal's keep shrank and swelled in men's minds. It was a giant. It was a folly. It was a fortress. It was a mirror. Rhaenyra watched the news of the Riverlands the way a ship's master watches a shoal, by listening for the tone of other men's voices. The faith made itself felt in the parts of the world that liked to be felt, and was ignored in the parts that did not. The warriors' sons planted themselves in King's Landing like a new row of trees and discovered the ground there was paved too hard to take roots easily. The poor fellows swarmed where law had to be asked for and the asking cost breath and bruises. Their sermons held law and longing in the same hand, and men mistook the one for the other as suits them. The High Septon, whose gentleness could turn to ice as quickly as any man's heat turns to steam, wrote a letter to Dragonstone signed in blue wax. He said, "You are a guest." He said, "You may not move furniture." He said, "You may not ask my children to call you mother." Rhaenyra read the letter aloud to Vermithor on a morning when the cliff was a knife and the sea wanted to cut itself on it. "Mother," she said to the dragon, smiling despite the steel, "do I look like one?" Vermithor opened his mouth and yawned in a way that made the world inside him visible, and thereafter the day went better for her. The first Valyrian steel to cross the narrow sea under her law came not as sword but as thread. Cohors smiths, who do not speak their secrets even to their lovers, sent needles forged of wire that took an edge if you dared to stroke it with your thumb. They were for Serge. Ons, and the first man to use one in Old Town cut a boy open and closed him again and the boy lived, and 3 maesters who had told their wives, if they had wives, that it was godless to use foreign steel on a child decided that God liked stitches that held. The citadel's lamps that night burned steadier for a minute, or the men who watched them only thought so because their hearts burned steadier in their ribs. In small things law wins wars. A lesser war began on the Stepstones, where neither law nor priests truly matter. The islands had for generations been knives stuck in a map to hold it flat, a place men scraped money off ships then threw the knives away when they pricked them. Pirates do not like letters, they like sails. They do not like dragons unless the dragons are sleeping far away, and men tell stories about them in shore taverns to make girls gasp. The Valyrian proclamation that any ship carrying human cargo under any flag that set foot on a quay touching Westeros would be considered enemy and treated as firewood pleased some pirates, and displeased others. Those who found it pleasing painted the Valyrian flame under their figureheads and charged twice as much for protection. Those who found it displeasing painted Braavosi blinds over their figureheads and took thrice as much in kind. Rhaenyra sent 3 ships with deep keels and 1 dragon who liked salt. Vermithor did not, but Visor, a sea-bellied grey that had never learned to love mountains, did. His rider was a woman from Valyria who braided coins into her hair and had eyes that made men think of sharks in water they could not see into. Her name was Mera, which in her tongue meant something between air and hunger. She took the islands one by one in a way that convinced pirates she sold a different product than most conquerors. She offered them law a rate. She did not ask them to pray. She asked them to put their knives away at noon. She asked them to count. She burned the ones who could not count. Counting is difficult at sea. The islands entered an odd peace, punctured by occasional screams that slowly grew rarer. Braavos watched and did not sharpen its swords, because sometimes even a first sword no steel will not sing his tune. The keyholders sharpened pencils instead. They made men in King's Landing special who had never before been special coppersmiths. Men who made hinges, girls who could count by sixteenths. They took their debts and forgave them and then asked for other things. They bought the services of the men who oiled the city's lamps. For 3 nights a month, the lamps on the streets leading to the Valyrian quarter burned a little dimmer. Men stumble in dimness. Men forget themselves. It was clever. Clever things fail when they forget the weather. On the 4th month, rain came so hard that every lamp guttered. No one noticed which streets were darker. Maris noticed everything that had to do with her tray, and she noticed the lampmen because oysters do not like darkness and men do. She had learned to watch hands long before she watched gods. She watched a lampman slip twice at the same corner and thought, dead. She watched him talk to a girl whose face had nothing in it for a second, like a pool when the wind leaves, and thought, bravos. She sold him 6 oysters for nothing and told him to throw the shells where she could see them. He threw them all in the same place on a night that was supposed to be bright enough men could see their own breath. After that, the lamp did not go as dim. Vermithor's wing complained more. He carried it lower, and when Rhaenyra touched the joint, she felt a heat that was not good fire. He bore her across the Crownlands and across the Blackwater in a patient, slightly irritated way that made her think of good horses. She shortened her flights. She sent younger riders to brazen the sky. She kept making law. She learned the names of boys who were killed when men threw iron on crowds to hear what noise they made. She learned the names of girls who turned debts into knives and the names of men who turned sermons into walls. She learned to let those names be someone else's work and not carry them until she could no longer walk. Word came from the Eyrie that a falcon had fallen from an impossible height and lived, which the Vale took for a sign that their gods liked them best. Word came from the rock that a tunnel had collapsed and buried 6 miners, and Lord Tywald paid the families himself and left his steward poor in public and rich in private. Word came from Dorne that a caravan of Carthene lacquer had reached Planky Town unmolested for the first time in 4 years, and Larisa said nothing to anyone, which for her was a prayer. Word came from the Iron Islands that a priest had drowned smiling, and the islands took it for a sign that their god liked them best. Word came from the Stepstones that Mara had hung a man by his thumbs over a hot spring until he told her where he had hidden a chest of gold, and then cut the rope and let him live. Word came from Bravos that the Sea Lord had changed rings. Word came from Pentos that a boy had been declared prince because a dozen men could not agree which prince should be declared. Rhaenyra held Dragonstone through all of it. She made the rock less hungry. She put men who stole bread to work in kitchens and men who stole knives to work cleaning stables. She banished a magistrate who had taken gold to let a Lycene slave ship water and did not let him go home to his villa. She sent him to the mines at Massey's Hook and visited twice to watch him carry stones that had been her laws once and could no longer be called that. She forged alliances the way the old smiths forged steel. Hammer, water, hammer again. She watched men like Maester Alistair find ways to love this work because the alternative was to watch it and call it sin. She watched the High Septon age and did not outlive him, which surprised those who liked to make prophecies. Argilac forced the thing that all the careful balance had been built to avoid. He rode to a ford on the Windwater with 300 Stormlanders behind him and told a Valyrian patrol to turn back and wait for his leave to pass. The captain on the bridge was a salt-haired Tyroshi who had learned to sound like a Westerosi when speaking to men who wanted to be obeyed by them. He said he had orders to ride, and he did not kneel, and Argilac drove his spear through the man's shoulder and pinned him to a plank. The bridge for a minute became a thing with 2 hearts, one that pumped blood and one that pumped law. Men killed because that is what men do when laws cannot decide among themselves. The river took this blood better than most. It had a taste for it. Argilac rode away with his men in order, which was what made it war, and sent a letter to the rock that said, "Watch which sun you warm yourself by." The rock sent back a cask of wine. Men in warmer rooms decided what to call the ford. Rhaenyra went to Old Town at once. She did not bring Vermithor. She brought a clerk with elegant hands and Maester Alistair and a woman from Cohor who knew how to make steel that remembered. They sat under the high tower's shadow while the Lord's men mended a lantern vane that a storm had bent and wrote an answer to the world. The answer had 6 parts and none of them were dramatic. It said, "Caravans will be escorted by men who bear no sigil and are paid from a joint purse." It said, "Any man who attacks such a convoy will be judged by both a septon and a magistrate and hanged if both agree." It said, "Dragons will not cross the Windwater without a bell being rung in Old Town that any man may hear for 20 miles around." It said, "Any man who throws a torch on a house bearing a flame banner will be cast out of the city that harbors him." It said, "Argilac is brave, and his bravery is not law." It said, "The faith will be paid for each sentence written in Valyrian that keeps a Westerosi safe." The High Septon refused to sign the last sentence and then did, because he believed he could spend the coin to buy food for orphans and because even the godly love to be paid for their pains. The ford acquired a name, the Spear Bridge, and a harvest song that turned Argilac into a hero in the mouths of men who had never seen a dragon and never would. The song made the patrol captain a villain in the first stanza, and a fool in the second, and a ghost in the third, which is how such ballads work when sung by men whose chiefs ride horses instead of ships. In ports, the song faltered and became about wine. In Old Town, it was banned from being played near the starry September, which made boys play it there faster and louder. In King's Landing, Maris learned a chorus and decided it was too long for men who drank with their ears more than their mouths. She cut it and sold 3 more oysters than usual with the time she saved. The Ironborn tried the lanes at last because there are only so many times a people can watch others make law on water and not test whether law floats. They fell on a string of cogs bearing reach apples and Dornish dates and northern hides. They were good at it. They had been born to it in the way some men are born to count, with thumbs that fit coin. They killed and took and threw men over the side who would have rowed for them if asked. They nailed a Valyrian quartermaster to his own ledger in a manner that showed a kind of artistry. Then Mera and Visor came out of a sky that had been apparently innocent 2 breaths before, and the Reavers learned the difference between love of salt and love of ash. Visor did not burn ships to coals. He drew fire lines across decks and left the ribs, as Rhaenyra had asked her riders to teach their beasts to do, and the water did the rest. Ironborn dragged themselves out of a warm sea and learned it could feel like knives if a dragon had licked it just so. They hated the lesson and remembered it. The drowned god hears men who have swallowed fire differently. The prayers gurgled. A winter bigger than the last rolled down from the shivering sea, and even Old Town's green hung its head. In Dragonstone's halls, ice made lace on shutters and sailor's breath steamed at tables like offerings. Grain stores opened on the days Rhaenyra had promised they would, and men measured her by that. Bravos loosened a noose no one had seen and forgave interest for 1 turn of the moon, because it is good to be seen to be merciful when you are winning. The faith fed orphans and hated the gratitude it made them feel toward merchants. The Rock counted its reserves twice a day and began paying men in wine again, which is a kind of cleverness. Winterfell plowed paths between houses with oxen that learned to love the work. In the Vale, men skied down slopes with barrels strapped to their backs because mountain men do not fear falling as much as others do. Dorne was kinder to itself than usual and did not starve, which is the highest compliment a desert pays to any ruler. Rhaenyra grew older the way stone does, weathered at the edges, stronger in the middle. She stopped riding Vermithor on days when the wind had a knife at its heart. She let younger men and women ride the show circles above keeps where law needed to sound like thunder. She lay on a couch in the Dragonmont with a sausage dog on her feet, some sailor's gift that had insinuated itself into her household and then into her affections, and listened to Maester Alistair read dispatches until his voice grew hoarse. She sent him away and read herself until her eyes watered and she could not tell letters from tears. She liked it when the sea had no white at all. A boy came from Qohor with black hands that had forgotten they were not born with soot on them and a blade wrapped in rags. He asked to see the lady who made law with dragons, and because men at gates have learned a nose for a story, he was sent up. He unwrapped the blade as men remove a bonda. To show what is not healing. It was not beautiful. It had that quality the best things have, of failing to be describable when you try. The light sat on it and did not slide off. He said he had carried it from a forge whose master had no sons and had finally decided the freehold should prove it could be trusted not to use gifts like whips. He said he had carried it under clothes and over water and in a sack of barley, and he had not slept properly in a year because he had learned to love the weight of it. Rhaenyra took it and did not lift it. She knew better than to make a scene of certain things. She set it on the table the way men set bread for company and said, "Thank you." She sent the boy away with coin that would alter his story's ending only if he wanted it to. She did not give the blade to a hero. She sent it north with a letter to Winterfell that said only, "Keep this safe." Torrhen read the letter in a kitchen because that is where he happened to be, warming his hands while his sister told a cook that onions do not salt themselves. He took the blade and did not swing it either. He put it in the crypt and had a mason close a wall and did not tell the mason what lay behind it. And at night he dreamed a little better because sometimes men sleep more soundly when they are responsible for something no one will thank them for. The doom did not come because it had not, and because it had not, the freehold continued to be a thing men could argue with. Volantis grumbled in tiger whispers and sent, in place of a ship, a letter with a drawing of a coin on it that was a joke and not a joke. Pentos sent girls whose hair smelled of fennel and letters that smelled of fear. Valyria sent nothing, but Mera's braids grew heavier. Norvos rang a bell. Qohor sent its needlemakers and surgeons began to work as if there were gods in their hands. Bravos tightened and loosened as suited it and grew a new guild of men who called themselves readers and could tell a shopkeep whether the coin in his palm had been minted east or west by listening to it hit a table. The guild grew fat. Men who do not fight must find music to teach their sons. In King's Landing, the Valyrian quarter became ordinary, which is both victory and failure. Maris grew lines at the corners of her mouth from squinting into sun and smoke. She married a man who could gut a fish faster than shame and bore a girl who refused to carry a tray and a boy who would not learn his letters but could remember what he had heard once and never quite heard it the same way again. She kept the coin in her boot until the day she realized it had worn a mark on her foot that would remain after she died, and she laughed and put the coin in a cup on the mantel and told it, "Very well, have your shrine." A girl who owed the debt man came to her door and left with a bowl of stew and a promise that did not have the word bravos in it. The lamps on the quarter streets burned steadily for a year. Argilac died as storm kings prefer, in a storm. He did not fall from his horse or his pride. He took a spear to the belly that would have killed any man and rode half a mile with it straight through him and then pulled it out and drove the man who'd given it to him into mud and held him there with the haft until the kicking stopped. He died later that night under a tent that let too much wet in, and he cursed Valyria before he cursed the wound. Men sang songs that made the spear a dragon and made the king a man who had never learned to bow. His daughter sent the spear to Old Town in a cart with a letter that said, "Make of it a law if you can." The Hightower hung it in a hall, and boys threw apples at it to see if they would stick, and then a Septon got a bruise on his head and it was hung higher. Torrhen outlived the Storm King and the High Septon and the Lord of the Rock. He did not fight a war, which is how history sometimes makes men into footnotes when they should be pillars. He kept his people fed. He counted his dead by winters and not by banners. He sent boys to the wall and asked for them back when the watch had enough men and did not fear to lose face by yielding them. He wrote few letters, and the ones he wrote were often short. Rhaenyra kept them. Vermithor's wing grew worse and better and worse. On the nights it was worse, Rhaenyra slept badly and walked the halls and remembered a day when she had been told that if she cut more cleverly she could cut war itself smaller. She had believed. She kept believing and never let on to anyone when she stopped, if she stopped at all. She knew a woman who could not stop believing is a fever, and a woman who cannot believe is stone. The Riverlands settled in a new law because no one strong enough to break it survived long enough to teach anyone else how. The spear bridge took toll for 7 years, and then the tollman drowned in 3 inches of water after a girl pushed him with 2 fingers. The road grew cheaper. The faith learned the price of printing sermons and found it affordable. The Citadel learned the price of better needles and found it indispensable. The Ironborn learned the price of burning ships with dragons in the sky and found it too high to pay more than biannually. The Freehold's men in the West changed, as men stationed far from home do. They married. They divorced. They learned the taste of oats cooked with ale and of fish baked with onions and of a cider that made them forgive weather. They taught their children 2 languages and then watched those children choose which words to forget. The Valyrian quarter in King's Landing grew less green. The paint peeled. Men fixed it. The magistrates' cloaks lost some of their sheen. They shone them again. Law is polishing. You do it every day, or the vessel you drink from stains. Maester Alistair died with his fingers stained the color of rust from touching iron he pretended to despise. He left a book he had not intended to write, which men who never knew him rea. And said, "See, we have always had this law that is not God and not Lord and not dragon. A place for a man to stand and say, I did not sign that." The book misled them in the way good books do by making a tide look like a choice. Rhaenyra read 2 pages and put it down and went to see the clerk who kept accounts of stores in a room that smelled of mice and ink. She thanked him for having always been early in his numbers. He wept afterward, which is how clerks handle praise, and then balanced his ledger down to the last onion. An old man came to Dragonstone who had once been a boy in Old Town with a scar on his lip. He had long since lost the name Snow and kept a bench by a gate where he told stories to boys and girls about a wall they had never seen and a wind that had opinions and a raven that could steal a man's patience when it wanted. He sat with Rhaenyra and told her what the wall looked like when you are the only man on it who has not yet learned he will not leave it. He told her what a winter looks like at dawn when the sun is a liar. She told him what a city looks like at sunset when the sea is honest. They did not make law. They made an hour that tasted of tea and apples and fear they could talk about without being unmade by it. He left her with a fur comb. She left him with a quill cut by her own hand, which wrote as if eager to show off. Braavos did not forget that it had been made by fear. It grew, as all such cities do, an aristocracy that pretended it had no old ghosts. The Sea Lord who had once tapped a ring and said, "By peace," died and was replaced by a man whose mouth did not move much when he spoke and whose eyes moved all the time. He made a calculation that would have suited Harren. That men who had grown used to steady law would accept 4 small cuts in a month if the month after they were given 6 small gifts. He applied it to King's Landing and to Old Town, and to men who oiled lamps and to men who joked for a living and to women who counted shells and to girls with faces like anyone's. He was successful as men always are until the weather changes. The weather changed on a day when Vermithor tried to rise and could not, and roared his frustration into stone that had learned his voice and did not care. Rhaenyra stood with her hand on his shoulder and let him rage until rage spent him, and then she climbed down and sat on basalt that had memorized heat and did not offer any. She did not weep. She did not pray. She did not call a maester. She told a boy to bring her apple beer and drank it where men could see, because sometimes law is the sight of someone not lying. The next morning she did what she had decided while the beer warmed her tongue. She convened a court, and she did not sit on a dragon-carved chair. She sat on a bench with ordinary legs and judged a quarrel between 2 men over a net that had caught fish neither of them could prove were theirs. She assigned the fish to a soup house and the net to the man who could mend it. And when they went away cursing her in different colors, she felt better than she had when she had drawn fire circles perfectly. The dragons slept more. The laws thickened. The freehold in Valyria elected a man to their council who had a face that made you believe he had never liked fire, which is a useful face in a world measured by it. Volantis sent a tribune who wore orange like the skin of a fruit men had begun to see at markets in Old Town in high summer. Cohor sent no one and then sent 3 at once, who spoke only to surgeons for 2 months and then disappeared into a wine cellar with a magistrate and came out with a contract that gave men who cut the sick an income, which is how you keep men caring. Norvos rang a bell twice. Pentos ran out of princes and found another under a table in a brothel who had more sense than he looked. Braavos blinked. The last time Rhaenyra crossed the Trident, she did it in a boat. Men who had seen her burn ships and stop burning when she wished watched her set foot in a skiff that smelled of pitch and gave no evidence it would bear her weight. She sat as still as old women do when the sea is testing them. The oars bit. The oarsman's arms shone like good wood. She watched a blue kingfisher stall over brown water and then strike, and she thought, even the careful must eat. She went to Riverrun and ate fish soup that had too much dill, and listened to a woman whose family had been loyal to Harren until it was wise not to be. They made a law about marshland spites. Men would no longer be allowed to break dams to flood fields to settle grudges. It was a small law. It saved a season's wheat for a woman who had not thought anyone would ever say her name in a hall. On the stepstones, Mara took a husband, because love finds even women who braid coins and ride dragons. He was a sailor with wrists like knots. He tied her a harness that made Visor more comfortable and made older riders nod and pretend it had been their idea. She had a child who screamed at the world and then went suddenly quiet the way children do when they find they can turn their rage into attention. The child rode before she could run. There will always be such children. Men wrote poems about a woman who could teach a dragon to make a figure 8 in fire. She did not read them. She read accounts. Torrhen died old, with his hand around a cup that had been his father's and his grandfather's, and with his sister's hand on the blanket because she had outlived him and could not decide whether to be angry at him for that. He had never bent the knee because there was no one to bend it to, and men called him the king who kept winter polite. Rhaenyra sent a letter that said only, "Thank you for your letters." The men who opened it in the great hall and read it aloud did not know what to do with its simplicity. They kept it and the cup together in a chest. Argilax's daughter married a man who did not deserve her and made him deserve her. That is, one way to make history. She taught her court how to make a bow without losing its line. She made a treaty with Oldtown that did not sign away a thing she cared about and gave away 3 things she did not. She stopped singing the song about the spear bridge and replaced it with one about apples and the way they taste when you have not eaten in a fortnight and then do. Her son learned to tend to men's feet before he learned to ride. The Stormlands grew up. The faith grew old in a way that made it less dangerous and more useful. A new High Septon learned to distinguish between affront and hunger. He ate with Rhaenyra once, which had made his predecessor apoplectic even in contemplation. He placed a crust on his tongue and said, "Your peace has too many numbers in it." She said, "Your wars had too few." He said, "Men want to feel something when they die." She said, "I want them to feel less when they live." They agreed to bless harbors and not armies, and then went on blessing armies when their sons marched out, because fathers are fathers before they are priests. Maris's coin sat in its cup like a tame son. She grew old and mean and generous and tired in ways that felt like work done properly. She taught a girl who was not her daughter to throw a knife and taught a boy who was not her son to spot a liar by the way his hands made shadows when he talked. She went once to the starry September and lit a candle and said nothing, and a priest who had once been the boy with the scar happened to see her and did not speak either. They shared a moment of not distracting a god. Vermithor died as men die, slowly, then all at once. He lay with his head on basalt as he had always done and let heat leave him in patient waves. Rhaenyra sat with him and told him the first lie she had ever told him, that nothing hurt. He closed his eye halfway and breathed a breath that had in it the smell of every field he had ever warmed, and then the remainder of that breath, which was cold, went into the hall and men saw it and tried to pretend there had been no sound at all. Rhaenyra placed her hand upon one scale and felt nothing but her own heat reflected back. And for a moment the room was a mirror, and she hated mirrors, and then she laughed because the only other thing to do would have broken her. She supervised the moving of that immense, beloved carcass with a professionalism that made men love her and fear her more. She had him lowered into a fissure he had liked to sleep above, and when men asked if she would burn him, she said, "He is already fire." She forbade any to take a scale. Men took one each anyway and then returned them the next day because their wives told them to. The fissure breathed a little smoke for a month. Men said it was him sighing. It was the earth rearranging. Without Vermithor, Dragonstone became more like other rocks and Rhaenyra more like other women. This made both more dangerous in certain ways. She rode less, wrote more. She took to walking the causeways at dawn with her cloak tight and her mind looser. She found herself listening to gulls and understanding them better than she once had. She adopted 2 more sausage dogs. She visited Oldtown one last time, and the Hightower's lord, older and kinder and more careful with the kindness, met her at the quay and offered her a chair that was not carved like anything at all. They watched boys carry barrels of fish up a ramp and did not talk about God. They talked about the price of tar. It was a better conversation than any they had had before. When she died, she did it in a bed too narrow for legend, and the woman from Qohor who had shown surgeons how to stitch clothes to life and make it remain closed sat at her feet and kept time with a thumb on an ankle pulse and then stopped keeping time. The sausage dogs slept through it. Maester Alistair was gone, and his student, who had been Edric Flowers, wrote in a hand clearer than his master's. She kept more promises than she made. He closed the book. The freehold did not leave Westeros. It did not conquer it. It left more laws than scars, took more coins than blood. It taught men to shop for peace even when they wanted war, and to expect war to be priced. It did not end slavery in the world. Men will always find a way to call chains something else if they like the weight. But in places where Dragonstone's banners had hung, and on roads where Rhaenyra's riders had drawn fire lines that curved like letters, and in markets where Maris had once counted, a thing was understood as naturally as the way you turn a coin to feel if it is true. A man could not be sold there. Men told their sons that, and their sons told theirs, and already they had begun to forget whom to thank. The doom never came. Valyria did not crack itself like old ice under too much spring. The 14 flames burned, and men fed them or in flattery. The freehold kept its arrogance in good repair, and its docks cleaner than its altars. But in the ledger men keep without knowing they have dipped a pen, the record scratched into the doorsill of this world that says what was paid and by whom. There is a column that reads, "Forbearance," and under it you can find, if you run your finger down through soot and time, smudged names. A woman who taught a dragon to stop where men lived. A king who counted winters as enemies and not men as numbers. A princess who remembered ash and forbade it softly. A city that learned to spend less fear. A clerk's wife who liked green figs, a boy who threw shells where a lamp could see them. A girl with coins braided in her hair. An old dragon, warm. And there is, at the very bottom, a sum you cannot add because it is not numbers. It is a sound, the hum of a careful fire in a dry house. It is the sound of men sleeping while the lamps burn, and of women waking early to stir the banked coals and feed them the smallest sticks first, so that the day comes on without smoke. It is the sound of law when it is not speaking hitches when it does its best work. It is the wind moving over a sea that has learned, slowly, to hold ships instead of secrets. It is the soft sigh of a fisher remembering heat, and of a coin set finally on a mantle without anyone needing to kiss it for luck.